everyone, welcome to the ESG webinar, Virtual Computing Infrastructures. My name is Caitlin and I will be your host. Procuring virtual computing infrastructures is going to become more of a business decision than most IT organizations are accustomed to. Are you ready? The buyers of virtual computing infrastructures are not concerned with the speeds and feeds of the infrastructure. They are focused on business priorities, time to market, and ultimately improving IT service levels to the businesses they support. Server virtualization and cloud computing are acting as the ideal catalyst to introduce this strategy to mainstream IT and change the way businesses consume IT infrastructure. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to review. Mark's presentation should take between 30 and 45 minutes. Afterwards, he will take questions. Throughout Mark's presentation, please feel free to enter your questions using the control panel. In addition, we are recording today's webinar and will be posting it on the website along with all of Mark's other work at enterprisestrategygroup.com. With that said, I would like to introduce Mark. Mark Bowker champions ESG's data center transformation practice, focusing on all things virtualization and cloud computing. In his current role, Mark researches the various virtualization technologies available and the impact these solutions have on IT strategies and the broader marketplace. Okay, Mark, take it away.
All right, Caitlin, thank you very much. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's webcast on virtual computing infrastructure. Definitely a topic we've been following really closely for the last, since I've been at ESG, really for the last 7 years, and it's really evolved a lot in those 7 years. So a quick little look at what we'll talk about today, a quick little view of the agenda. So we'll talk about what ESG's view is of virtual computing infrastructure. We'll go through some trade-offs, essentially looking at the advantages and disadvantages of one infrastructure decision over the other, and specifically here looking at x86 virtualization hardware platforms, really. Then we'll look at a use case reference guide. So there's some specific use cases that we find match nicely with some decisions over the other. So we'll actually look at those and try to match those up the best we can based on what we're seeing out there from an implementation standpoint. We'll talk a little bit about at the end just some steps for planning for that investment and how it is actually a little bit different than some of the what I'd say more traditional procurement and implementation means that we've seen in IT over the years. And then also as part of this, as Caitlin was saying, we did a market report. So we have essentially a 15-page-ish research report on this that specifically looks at these different infrastructures and includes a vendor review. So in this particular one, we talked to 9 different vendors, and we'll walk through those and show some of their solutions specifically at the end of the presentation. And as Caitlin said, by all means, please forward us your questions as we go through the presentation as well. So here on slide number 3, the first thing we look at is virtual computing infrastructure. So server virtualizations created a catalyst for change inside of IT, lots of different catalysts. Not only has it been from new infrastructure, but it's also been from a data protection point of view, a security point of view, even the way that we actually build a service back into the IT. But the biggest impact we see is really around server storage and networking. And there's been a choice that people are given how to do this. The first choice, very, very popular inside of IT, is this DIY or do-it-yourself model. So the other option, which we'll talk about in a second, is integrated computing. But the first one we'll look at is DIY or do-it-yourself. So this method kind of reminds me years ago, I used to take all these different components, and believe it or not, Caitlin, I could take all these, put it on the table, I could plug it all in, and magically the computer would work. My parents thought I was crazy, but it was, the way that you used to kind of assemble PCs in the past. And it was actually a great way to do things, but quickly learned maybe there were some other options. Before ESG, I was actually in IT, and what happened? What happens, your data center often looks like this. It's kind of messy. We kind of do see this often. This isn't unusual to see. There's certainly better pictures of this or better examples of this. But certainly this is kind of where a lot of people are very comfortable with this do-it-yourself type of method. I really kind of equate this to if I go out and build a shed, I go out and buy a bunch of 2x4s, I put all the different 2x4s together, and I kind of see what I've got at the end. I didn't really do any planning, but ultimately at the end of the day, I've kind of used some super glue and duct tape to keep things together. So that's do-it-yourself. The next means, as we've broken it out here, is there's an integrated approach to take. And that integrated approach really comes in two flavors. It comes in a reference architecture or a pre-configured solution. So with a reference architecture, think a little bit differently. Now instead of going out and buying a bunch of 2x4s, you know what? I've gotten a little bit smart about this. Let me draw a little plan about what I'm going to do. Start to think about it on paper before I decide my material list of actually what I need. At the end of the day, when I do this, I can actually start to build something that looks like something that I planned ahead of time. And we see this in IT as well. I give a couple examples of a couple different reference architectures on the right-hand side here. These are typically written documents, varying lengths. I've seen 30-page one. I've seen 200-page reference architectures. But it really serves as a blueprint or a guideline to deploy a piece of infrastructure for a specific purpose. So here we see people where I've seen this popular is around the specific application. For instance, I've seen somebody take Microsoft Exchange, look at a reference architecture with one of these hardware vendors or with a hardware vendor and start to map it to their implementation that they're working on. So this is really now, instead of buying the 2x4s, now I've gone off, built a plan, I know the exact material list I did, and I actually can start to build that IT infrastructure. The other integrated approach is a pre-configured solution. So in shed terms, that's where we drive down the street, go to the place that makes the sheds, we walk inside the shed, pick it out, and they deliver it to us. It shows up on our lawn, placed exactly where we want to. We can immediately start putting our rake shovels and lawnmowers in it. Same idea with pre-configured solution from an IT perspective. So here, that solution, server, storage, network, specifically designed for x86 virtualization, comes fully racked and stacked, delivered to your doorstep. It's not a bunch of boxes that show up. That would be more of the reference architecture approach. But here, in many cases with these pre-configured solutions, it's actually been productized to be delivered and integrated as a single unit, single SKU, easy for the customer to order, and also easy for them to quickly see some of the value here around time savings, quick time to value, and obviously lines up to some specific strategies that we'll kind of go over when we look at the use cases as well. So just as a review, virtual computing infrastructure, x86, creating a catalyst for change. I have options of deployment or consumption when it comes to purchasing hardware, server storage and networking in particular. I can take the DIY method. By the way, we see a lot of people still doing this, which I'll show you in a second. But there's also a more integrated approach I can take. And this is really with that reference architecture and pre-configured solution. We started to do some research on this particular topic and asking about how would you describe your organization's interest level in integrated computing platform about 2 years ago. This data here is from about 18 months ago, and you can see even back then 10% of people were already using it, with another 11% very interested, and even another 26% interested beyond that. So this piece of research alone gave us further validation to start looking and digging into this further. This year, each year, ESG does an IT spending intentions report. So here we're looking at what are current trends in the industry, what are the top business drivers, what are our top IT initiatives, and ultimately how are they mapping with where IT is going to invest and spend. This year, in 2012, we asked the question, which of the following best describes your organization's current infrastructure for its virtualization/private cloud environment, and which do you believe would be your organization's preferred infrastructure? And along the bottom axis there, we go along the exact taxonomy I just shared. So it's do-it-yourself, reference architecture, fully integrated. On the left-hand column in the blue is your current virtualized infrastructure model, and the yellow is preferred. Start with do-it-yourself, you look actually a pretty significant drop-off. 46 to 28% choosing that do-it-yourself over that preferred infrastructure. Reference architecture, pretty flat. I think that makes sense in certain use cases, and we'll go over what some of those are in a minute. But the thing that really stands out here is the gap between the current usage of fully integrated solutions and the preferred model. People are starting to see some of the benefits there, which we'll go over in a second. But there's a significant uptake in the interest level and integration implementation of these fully integrated solutions. So now the eyes are even open further. So now we're asking, well, what are the benefits? If you're looking at integrated computing, I'm a do-it-yourself guy. That's why I've been in IT. I really value those skill sets I've built over time. But here with integrated computing, we've asked, what do you believe an integrated computing platform offers your organization? Biggest one here is we kind of switch it around. A lot less focus is spent on what I'd say at a product technical level on the speeds and feeds of that actual solution. But more and more focus is spent on things here. Ease of management, a great one where people are looking to drive these systems into the organization and simplify the daily operations and daily interaction with that hardware that I have. Faster deployment time is an excellent example why people choose these. So we'll go over some specific use cases and where it makes sense. But here it's as simple as a CIO recognizing the benefits of an integrated platform and being able to see where they've been able to shrink what could have been a multiple 10-month plus implementation cycle down significantly shorter. We've even seen it go down 2-3 times faster deployment times based on their choice of an integrated computing solution. And then you see other things there about driving down total cost of ownership, less resources required, as well. So those are some things that we'll track just from an overall benefits perspective of integrated computing. The other thing that we keep track of, because the consumption or consuming these solutions is changing the way IT is actually thinking about infrastructure as well. So also in 2012, as part of our IT spending report, we ask, this is ultimately me as an IT person justifying investment. So here, which of the following considerations do you believe will be the most important in justifying IT investments, essentially over the next year and a half? If you look at the top here, business process improvement now has accelerated past many of these other cost, basically capital or operational type of justifications. What's interesting there is the alignment between these integrated computing solutions and the improved business process improvement. So a lot of these solutions we see being driven into the organization aren't because, oh, it's reduced our capital expenditures in infrastructure. It really comes down to we've been able to improve the time to market with a specific application. We've been able to implement a new project in a much shorter time, which has been able to streamline productivity on the other end. Are really some of the forward-thinking ways that we see integrated solutions being adopted. The next, as I said at the beginning, we'll look at understanding some of these trade-offs. So as with any technology, this doesn't change across IT. There's always advantages or disadvantages of doing one over the other. So the first one we'll look at on the column all the way to the left-hand side is do-it-yourself. Guess what? That's really familiar to a lot of IT admins. This is the world they've grown up in. This is where they've developed their expertise. They have the skill set in-house. This is how they've been trained. They've been able to maintain a relationship with the vendor, become trained on that vendor, and even be able to take a best-of-breed approach by working together with the different teams, having a server team deploy their server infrastructure with a networking team and storage team and so forth. So here it's just very familiar. People are comfortable with it is what it really comes down to. As we know, if we kind of slip down to the disadvantages, it can be pretty complex. Guess what happens when a problem arises? Everybody's pointing fingers at each other. How do we fix it? Who's responsible for what? And ultimately, unless you have high familiarity with all those different pieces of infrastructure, troubleshooting or even just implementation of a project can be time-consuming. The other thing that we see is you still have to deal with support from multiple vendors as well. So if I have deploy hundreds of virtual machines in an environment, I choose X server vendor and storage vendor and network vendor, and I have a troubleshooting issue. Sure, I may try, and likely what happens is I start with that virtualization provider first, but quickly now I have to go through and work with those different support organizations from the hardware perspective as well. And we find this resonating well. People who see a high pain there are more likely to skip over to some of these solutions on the right-hand side. So if I look at underneath integrated computing platforms, I've got the two options again here, reference architecture and pre-configured. Reference architecture, this is that blueprint, right? This is where I've actually taken a set of plans and used it as a guideline. And it eliminates a lot of the guesswork. So we see a lot of, and I use these in IT as well, where you go through there and you start understanding it's almost a step-by-step guide how you're going to implement that infrastructure based on the application requirements. So in many cases, it can actually help accelerate a problem because you've actually followed that blueprint and you're able to look back at that blueprint and understand where things may have gone wrong. The disadvantages, though, is you may not have assembly included here. It's going to be somebody's role or somebody's responsibility to actually assemble those different components. And sometimes that's IT organization itself. It may be through a partner or reseller. But at some point, somebody's going to put those different pieces together, make sure they fit together. I've seen plenty of errors happen just from taking it out of the box and cabling it, as opposed to even really what I'd say deeper tweaking of the system. The other thing is a lot of times with these reference architectures, if they don't have a lot of flexibility to step away from that design. So if I have a specific application, a custom application, custom requirements based on my existing infrastructure, they don't always marry up nice to what I have. So there may be still some gap between that reference architecture and existing solution that you need to be aware of. If I step over to pre-configured solution, there's some pretty interesting advantages here. Here, when it comes to that test and build process, where I just mentioned kind of really the unboxing and racking and stacking of things, I say it eliminates there. It certainly significantly streamlines things, absolutely. There's more of a turnkey approach and quicker time to value. We've seen some of these systems literally get rolled out of the box, plug it in, or slid into essentially an aisle, turned on pretty quickly and be able to create virtual machines pretty rapidly. We've seen some of these VDI environments actually stand up in a production environment in days, where some of these other VDI environments where I've seen other people take approaches, it's taken weeks or months. In some cases here, it can actually shift some of the responsibility from a patching and updates perspective when you have a single vendor or multiple sets of vendors, as some of these solutions are, lined up from a roadmap or product perspective. Even if it's internally all coming from the same system vendors, you're understanding that you're getting a streamlined method of support, and obviously those patches and updates are going to be ideally pushed together with those different products as well. Now, some of the disadvantages, and they should come no surprise to anybody that has started to look at these, oftentimes they scale in very large margins. They aren't very customizable. There's some fear from a business perspective or an IT perspective. They get locked into a different solution, but that's not any different than really from a networking or single component perspective. So that's a big IT fear in general. There's not a lot of customization of these. There's some modularity with some of them that you can say, okay, I need more storage or more bandwidth from that perspective. But in general, there's not a lot of customization with some of these initial solutions out there. I think there's a lot of, from a management perspective, I think there's a lot more value that's untapped here that people haven't fully recognized, and people haven't quite even valued the benefits of what I'd say more intelligent management and orchestration in a virtualized environment. And these solutions certainly tap into some of that, but it hasn't been fully recognized by IT. And other things that keep important too, we've seen some pretty interesting, what I'm going to call private cloud deployments that are not installed, that are not incorporated what I'd say commercial type of virtualization solutions. They take more of an open source approach, and I haven't seen any of these pre-configured solutions align with these open source approaches as well. So to keep that in mind based on where you are from an IT goals perspective. The next step here is we'll look at some use case references. So we'll walk through a couple different use cases and how they may map up with those different type of integrated computing solutions. So the first one here, and this is the biggest one, this is kind of where server virtualization has been born, bred, and still continues to flourish. So this is really just basic server virtualization focused on consolidation and cost containment. This is where people can quickly virtualize. If you take that do-it-yourself model, people have been able to take their existing skill set, their existing investment, their existing relationship with vendors, been able to get to the point where maybe in some cases it's actually required them to buy new infrastructure, but they've been able to pretty much take what they know and what they own using the DIY method and quickly get to that point where they're 20-30% virtualized. Now, if you guys haven't heard me say 20-30% virtualized, pretty simple. That next 5% can be very difficult. And based on what you've chosen from an infrastructure perspective is really critical at this point, because it really determines how quickly you can move to that next stage of maturity with your virtualization goals and initiatives. If you're just focused on this use case, consolidation and cost containment, I think reference architectures have some play. I'd say where we see them successful is if you have an organization that recognizes, yes, that's their initial goal around consolidation, cost containment, but they're quickly going to accelerate past that. I think then the reference architecture starts to make some sense and can get pretty interesting and take some of the guesswork out of things. I haven't seen anybody do a pre-configured solution just for consolidation and cost containment. It's typically aligned with other things, which I'll go over in a minute. But it's difficult to justify that investment. The value really kicks in, what I'd say, in latter or more mature phases of adoption. And I think what the value becomes really with some of these pre-configured solutions is looking more across standardization across server storage and networking, and also some of the common support model. And if you're just on consolidation cost containment, a lot of times it's IT-owned workloads. They haven't shifted up to that next tier of applications. Which kind of gives us to the next use case. And this one's really around mission-critical, business-critical application deployment. So if you think here, this is an IT organization, it's done a good job at consolidation and cost containment. Everybody walks around the IT department high-fiving each other. They've really consolidated things, have seen some great benefits, but now I have to start looking at some applications that essentially really run the business and are really relied on from a productivity perspective. So here, IT shops that have the skill set in-house can tap into those and actually take advantage of the DIY method. And we see people going to that next phase, looking to deploy some of these applications on that virtualized platform with success. So I'd say there, based on skill set, based on experience, based on knowledge, some success for sure. Where we see a reference architecture start to kick in is very application specific. So somebody may want to deploy a specific application. It may be SAP, for example, any of the Microsoft applications, Exchange, SharePoint, SQL, would all be interesting examples where the reference architecture is actually referred to and oftentimes followed closely to take these applications into a production environment, into a virtualized environment. Some of the initial pre-configured solutions, we see a lot of the vendors specifically going to market around a specific application. So looking at a pre-configured solution to run an application in a highly optimized environment. So here, this is if I put my CIO shoes on for a minute, this is, we need to put this application in production. We recognize virtualization as being a very viable technology that we want to use. We don't want to take any risks. We want it to perform well. We want it to be resilient. We want it to be reliable. We want to streamline what we've been doing from an operations and management perspective. That's where a pre-configured solution starts to become very attractive to organizations. The next use case that we touch on, and I'm going to take this one backwards. So VDI, or virtual desktop infrastructure, is actually the most popular workload that we see deployed on a pre-configured solution. So as we go through the different ones, we'll actually show some of these different vendors, but in many of the ones that we talk to, they say this is the leading use case. And if you think about why it is one is the impact it's going to have from an end user productivity standpoint. You do not want to impact that in any way. It impacts their entire environment, not just a single application. The other thing is VDI tends to be very complex. Server virtualization, relatively easy to spin up virtual machines and get some things configured. But desktop virtualization, or VDI specifically here, gets to be pretty complex, and to quickly take the complexity out of that and deploy a VDI implementation quickly with confidence aligns well with what a pre-configured solution has to offer. And essentially what's there is we've already proven, validated, certified, have existing customers in-house using this type of solution for their VDI type of environment. Reference architecture, pretty interesting as well. This is where you can take all those different components as part of a VDI environment. There's certainly ones from those leading vendors, Citrix, Microsoft Quest, VMware, for example, that have that implementation guidance with the reference architecture. It is a great way to start if you have some of those capabilities in-house and looking to use across maybe even an existing set of server storage and networking. That gets pretty interesting. Where I see a lot of people fail, though, with VDI is if they take that DIY method. If they take the method where they've actually taken with server virtualization and started to put those pieces together themselves, they understand that the complexity around VDI gets pretty cumbersome, and to be able to overcome that ends up resulting in a failed proof of concept. So here, I'd say the big takeaway is the majority of deployments we see on that pre-configured solution are absolutely that VDI workload. And I can't have a presentation without cloud computing in it, of course, but on the serious side here there's some pretty interesting architectures that are starting to go out there. When I say cloud computing, I'm specifically saying x86 virtualization in really a highly managed and high-scale environment. We have seen examples where people have taken the DIY method with where they have that advanced skill set in-house. So for example, if I have a healthy organization of application architects and application designers that work very closely with IT operations, larger enterprises, we have seen people actually take even some open source type of initiatives with that respects. Reference architecture starts to get pretty interesting here. Okay, now I want to take my virtualization investment, advance it to the next level, start to look at some of the tenets of cloud computing, typically around self-service, elasticity, scalability, chargeback, all those things that are really associated with cloud computing. And I want to start to build that into my environment. Now, it may not focus on all those different components. They may have a specific one they're trying to focus on, but a reference architecture enables them to do that. Pre-configure gets pretty interesting. I'll say one of the market segments that's pretty interesting in a pre-configured solution for cloud computing ends up being a service provider or hosting provider. They can quickly turn up essentially the services their potential customers are looking for with this pre-configured solution, knowing that it has been tested and validated and certified specifically to deliver virtual machines out to an end user. It gets pretty interesting even from how people choose this, that when they're looking at a pre-configured solution for cloud computing, they aren't necessarily focused on the ROI or TCO of that solution. They're really looking at how can we actually eliminate procurement of different infrastructure, or ultimately how does it align with their cloud strategy. So another interesting use case for pre-configured solutions. So really wrap it up here, and then we'll actually look at some of the vendors here. But the biggest thing, and Caitlin said this at the beginning, right, that virtualizing or the procuring virtual computing infrastructure is going to be very different than the way we actually are accustomed to procuring infrastructures today. So in the past, if I had a new workload or a new project, I may go out and buy a server. I may leverage some storage I already have in place and plug into an existing network backbone. With virtual computing infrastructures, there's going to be planning that needs to happen to understand what is this based on. Is it based on a project that I'm doing? Is it based on a specific application? And you're going to have to understand what's your existing workload that you've targeted for this integrated type of solution today, and where do you expect that to go in the next 3 to 5 years, really, looking at that life expectancy of that system itself. The other thing is understanding if you have really where it goes with your present mode of operations, where you may be taking an application or virtualization investment today, and how you can actually bridge a longer term strategy with integrated computing to build across the two. I think it's fair to say too that we don't want to misguide anybody thinking that we believe everybody should be running out the door tomorrow and buying an integrated computing solution, and that's going to be all new purchases in 2012 and beyond are going to be integrated computing. It's going to take a while for IT to change and recognize that value. So I think we give a lot of guidance into IT about familiarizing themselves with server network storage and roadmap, and even management vendors roadmaps to understand what some advantages may be or benefits as they invest in it as well. Also, from an IT perspective, it really comes down to looking at a skill sets and knowledge perspective. There's a lot of transition that we believe is boiling up inside of IT. There's a lot of people inside of IT that are really considering themselves administrators. The management paradigm to switch actually over to more of that management automation role, management of systems, we do believe is rising to the top, and I think IT has to be aware of that. These integrated solutions fall well, or they replace nice into that thinking and strategy. It's just more education awareness to be able to understand how they fit across. The other thing I mentioned at the beginning about how are people justifying investments, they're really looking at how does it impact business process. So making sure solutions like this, when we talk about maybe buying a new server, it may be about, well, we need to look at the latest chipset, or it holds this much memory, the backplane's able to give us this. If I'm looking at an integrated computing solution, it's more about how does it improve our ability to go to market faster? How does it improve our time to value for this new system? How does it enable our developers to get quicker access to resources? Those are the type of opportunities that we see aligning well and being some of the initial catalysts for integrated solutions. And then the other one too is you really got to do your homework just from a virtualization perspective, what those different hypervisors are doing, whether it's commercially available or open source available, and understand how they map into some of these solutions and how the vendors are ultimately going to support them. So the last thing on our list is I've got 2 slides on the different vendors that we'll walk through here. So there's 9 vendors altogether. And quickly across the top, so you understand what the columns are. They're pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go through them. List the vendor on the left-hand side. Then we've got the 2 types of integrated computing platform, whether it's pre-configured or a reference architecture. There's a little bit there that I'll let you read, but if you get your hands on the full copy of the report, you can dive into much more detail, but just a couple key differentiators, and then gives the website of the different solution. So the first one in alphabetical order here is on Dell. Dell has solutions that they term vStart. So anything you hear their vStart line is a pre-configured solution that they have available. This is a true turnkey racked and stacked, specifically designed and developed for x86 virtualization. They are also part of, so Microsoft has their Fast Track Partner Program. And this program here is specifically looking at a reference architecture to deploy System Center and Hyper-V on that infrastructure as well. Fujitsu, a little less known here in North America, but certainly not the case in other parts of the globe. They have and had some time for some time specific solutions around SAP, for example. So they have FlexFrame specifically is running x86 virtualization for SAP. They have something called a DI block. Again, this is a pre-configured solution specifically designed for an application. They're also part of that Microsoft Fast Track Partner Program. Intel has a program they're part of as well, as part of that reference architecture program that they're building on. HTS, maybe a little surprise here. Not many people, or they aren't known for what they do from their compute blades, but they actually do have a blade product. Their pre-configured solution is UCP, Unified Compute Platform, specifically looking at the blades, storage, and networking from that perspective. They are also a Microsoft Fast Track partner. HP has their virtual systems, the 1 through the 3. Those are the pre-configured solutions, very comparable to what Dell is doing with vStart. Sized a little bit differently, you just got to kind of understand the different pieces there. And again, they're part of the Microsoft Fast Track program as well. IBM has some specific reference architectures around Blade Center Foundation for Cloud. They've got it nicely named small, medium, and large. And then they're a Microsoft Fast Track partner as well as part of that Microsoft program. And then the last 4 vendors that we worked with closely were NEC. They have a reference architecture, Cloud Platform Standard Enterprise, Data Center, and they're a Microsoft Fast Track program. The next one's pretty interesting. It's actually 2 vendors getting together. This is NetApp with their storage and Cisco with their UCS and their networking. They've got the FlexPod, and they are part of the Microsoft Fast Track program as well. Oracle, very specific and, as you can imagine, very aligned with their applications that they are delivering to the enterprise, and they have a solution that's optimized solution for enterprise cloud infrastructure as a part of their reference architecture. And then, well, last on the list, to be quite honest, is probably one of the more known companies out there is VCE. They've got their vBlock series and out there as well. And these are very much aligned with some of the x86 virtualization platforms, integrated computing platforms that we see out there. In the report, these go into more detail about each of these vendors, walks through them in a little bit more depth. And we actually, and Caitlin will tell you how to get the report, but have some ways that you can get it right here.
Thank you, Mark. We have a few questions from the audience. Before we get to questions, I would like to direct everyone to scan the QR code on the right of your screen or click the link below it if you do not have the QR scanner. Here you can get the slides from today's webinar and also download a free copy of the Virtual Computing Infrastructures Market Landscape Report. Okay, our first question is there an associated cost premium with the integrated computing solutions?
That's a great question. So that's a question we get all the time, thinking that, hey, if I'm either a channel partner or if I'm an enterprise IT, why don't I just go purchase all these individual components by myself? I'm pretty good at this. I can put these together. If I'm a partner, really that's where my value is coming from. If I'm enterprise IT, I'm really pretty good and I've gotten good at this. We haven't done a really deep cost analysis of the different ones. I'll say a couple things here. When I've asked the question of the vendors, they absolutely agree that there is a cost premium with these different solutions. I've been surprised in some of the things that they've shared with me confidentially, how minimal it is. So that's been pretty interesting observation from our part. And the other thing that is interesting is the people that are looking at these integrated computing solutions, and that's why it's a great question, Caitlin, is they aren't focused on they're focusing on cost beyond the typical ways that they measure and evaluate cost of IT infrastructure. If they can take an integrated solution and, for instance, they put VDI up in a production environment in 2 months as opposed to 18 months, there's clear cost savings that can be revamped there, and they're considering all those factors. So certainly there is a cost premium, but the ones that are starting to be the early adopters of these integrated computing solutions are recognizing the value beyond what I'd say core infrastructure cost.
Okay, the next question is, are integrated computing solutions a viable option for a mixed workload environment?
So that's a great question too. So I went through a lot of examples, right? And there was a use case. It was VDI, which was VDI only. It was cost and consolidation, but really aimed that towards a DIY model. We talked about business critical applications where really a lot of the solutions that are integrated computing solutions out there, we see aligned with a specific application. I think there's a lot of opportunities for the vendor community out there to specifically look at a mixed workload environment. I think that that is being missed in some cases. I'm not saying I don't see people deploy it in that way, but the way I see it actually being brought to market is around specific applications. So specifically for SAP or specifically for VDI, for example. I think there's lots of opportunity, and we get asked a lot of questions about if I'm going to deploy integrated computing infrastructure, how does that align with my existing virtualization investment, my investment in infrastructure, and then ultimately how do I bridge between what I'm doing today or the investment I made in with that integrated solution as well. So I think there's a good opportunity there. It's not talked about enough, and I really don't see people actually procuring and adopting specifically for a multi-workload environment yet today. But great question.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are out of time for today. We are sorry if we could not answer all of your questions, but a recording of this webinar will be available tomorrow on the Enterprise Strategy Group website, www.enterprisestrategygroup.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on future ESG webinars.